all, I would let my very known wing introduce herself, and then we'll go over the teams. Wing.
Hi, I'm Milla, and I also have no preference, thank you.
Okay, so now we'll go over the teams. Feel free to introduce yourself and your preferred gender pronoun if you like. Also, please let me know who's speaking first and who's second from every team. Opening government.
Miri speaking first, she please.
Lucy speaking second, she exclusively.
Thank you. Opening opposition.
When speaking first, she, her.
Sorry, Pascal speaking second, he, him, his.
Thank you. Closing government.
Kira speaking first, I have no preference.
Hamza, no preference, please.
Thank you. And closing opposition.
Mette is speaking first and Miriam is speaking second.
Thank you. I'm going to time on my phone, but I'm going to be muted so to not interrupt you. So I'm going to clap, but you're not going to hear it. So please also time yourselves and everything will be very good. Good luck for the last round. And I'm happy to call the Prime Minister to open the debate.
Just to check that I am audible.
Oh, by the way, should we briefly just check streaming consent? Because I think not everyone has maybe indicated that.
Oh yeah, I think it was done on the chat, so I thought it's finished, but yeah. Is there still people that did not?
Yeah, sorry, I had written on the chat, I'd let you know after prep. It should be fine, I think. Yeah, fine. Yeah,
So we're good?
Yeah, sure, whatever.
So Prime Minister.
Panel. Very often, the kind of funding that China would give to US universities would be tied to a lot of things. It would first be tied to having Chinese students and researchers there. However, those Chinese students and researchers wouldn't just be free to conduct whatever research they want or to engage in whatever speech they want. They would still be very much controlled and surveilled by the Chinese state. Secondly, we think that China is very likely to have a lot of demands and standards of things that can be looked into and things that cannot be looked into, things that are okay to say and things that are not okay to say. Things that are okay to touch and things that these researchers or whatever department is being funded will not be safe going anywhere near. We believe that education and research should not be tied in any way, especially in a liberal state and also in a leading state in education and development, such as the US, should never be tied to a state that exercises full control over its citizens, over their speech, that even attempts to control their thoughts, to censor any dissent, or even any trace of critical thinking towards the state. We believe that at a point at which the US legitimizes it, that would be incredibly harmful. I will look at education and research and why this will not necessarily lead to improvements towards liberalization in China in this case. Second, I will look at the way China has been using the students and the researchers it's been funded, and how they have also been linked to Chinese intelligence. And lastly, I will look at what the role of universities in the United States even is and why that would go against it. So I know that there's an argument usually that allowing people more access to education and research is usually just a very good way to engage in more open discussion. But we've seen throughout the last few decades, and this is absolutely not the case with China. One, because it's very, very powerful, right? It has so much money and so much territory, and like it sits under security control. It can basically do whatever it wants, so it doesn't need to listen. But secondly, also because of precedents, we've seen that it has been paying for a lot of students and researchers to go abroad to study at US universities or other universities in the Western world. It has paid them to attend the WUDC, right? However, that has not meant at any point that these Chinese students or researchers have been free to engage in anything, right? So they have already had many people access higher education and experience liberalism. However, that has not led to any meaningful reduction in the control that the state exercises, right? But also, we think that we have also seen that literally the whole output is being fed back to China, right? And they are still very much tied by Chinese expectations. At the point at which these researchers are strongly limited in what they can do or say, this is very likely to extend to the departments that are being funded by Chinese money, right? We've seen that even when Chinese students can observe, participate in critical thinking, such as the WDC, simply the mere thought of them being seen listening to criticism of China was too dangerous for them, and they had to exit WDC final, right? They have stopped there are universities, university departments in the West that had taken money from China and that had to stop their students from protesting for Hong Kong because of the university being afraid of losing its money from China, right? So I think that at the point in which this is something that is a significant amount of funding, losing that significant amount of funding is very problematic, right? So the kind of research that can be done is obviously going to be tampered with, right? But also the speech of employees is going to be probably even if not monitored, they are still going to be afraid that they could be monitored, that there are things they could not be saying, or they could lose their jobs, or even worse, they could lose the funding for the entire department. Closing, do you have any POI? Opening?
Okay, so if China wants to maintain a closed state where people aren't exposed to criticism of China so badly, then why do they send people to the US at all rather than doing everything internally?
Because they still need access to the knowledge, because they're also trying to win the competition in having access to the most technology, to the most knowledge, right? They are funding a lot of people to become excellently educated, but then they also go back and feed that excellent education and excellent knowledge into strengthening the Chinese state and into strengthening the Chinese surveillance system, right? I mean, a lot of the people that have developed a lot of the incredibly efficient surveillance equipment that China is being used were people that were originally being taught in the West and then went back to put their skills for quite terrible use, right? So we've also seen that very often Chinese students abroad are linked, or at least thought to be linked, to Chinese intelligence, right? So this is used as a means of control by China in more liberal countries, right? It's a means to infiltrate universities and use this to funnel back information, right? But we think that universities are meant to be a safe bubble for research and development, right? Research beholden to Chinese government views or even used for Chinese government purposes are very problematic. But also, we think that the US universities are exclusively there to benefit the United States, right? Even private universities are there to benefit the people who are funding it, which in the vast majority of cases are US students, and probably most private universities in the US are found by endowments that are being provided by very wealthy US donors, right? But also we believe that universities are meant to be places of safety, right? So for example, any students also from abroad that might want to travel to the US are supposed to be there in a safe space, right? So for example, Hong Kong students that would end up getting to US universities and then would realize that the Chinese surveillance apparatus is following them even there, right? They would probably feel legitimately threatened. There would probably be a lot of fear for students from oppressed places. We believe that universities are very often the most advanced research and development that we can do, but also they are the only places in which we can look tentatively into things that aren't necessarily designed to be monetized, right? So if we want to develop facial recognition software or more advanced surveillance software, that is not the kind of software that we would want any high-tech company with an incentive to profit from it to develop, but rather is the kind of technology that we would want to be developed in universities or by the state. We think that there's a lot of technology and a lot of knowledge that is very important for us to look into, but is not the kind of technology or knowledge that we would want to be funneled back to China, because we believe that it's illegitimate to allow Chinese interest to dictate what happens in US universities. I'm begging you to propose.
Thank the Prime Minister, and happy to call the Leader of Opposition.
Okay, am I audible? Sorry. China and the US are two global superpowers who have very little ideologically in common, and research is one of the few ways in which they cooperate, especially in the context of a trade war. And we think it is really important that that cooperation does not go away because the whole world benefits from it. 2 points. First, why this will worsen US-China relations and why that is bad for the entire world. Second, why more university research in general is good and important. But firstly, extraneous rebuttal. The first thing I want to point out is that from OP, we are perfectly happy to regulate the kind of research that is done that is funded by China. We don't have to fund like their facial recognition technology, for example. We don't have to accept Chinese funding for that. We were fine with banning funding for things that are likely to be co-opted by the Chinese state for Chinese state oppression. We think that we are happy to accept funding for things like green energy research, for things like pharmaceutical research, which China also funds quite a bit of. With regards to their case, I think that and I just want to highlight, they have to never, ever accept Chinese funding to universities. We can accept just the good parts. I like being off on this motion. So I want to highlight also, with regards to their case, I think that this has to be seen comparatively. Yes, it is true that Chinese students often don't have freedom of speech and freedom of thought in American universities. However, I think it is still clearly comparatively better for those students when they're in the US than when they're in China, because at least in the US, they are more likely to be exposed to outside ideas at all. I think that they are not going to be any more free when they're in China. They are still going to be prevented from speaking out against China, but frankly, China is far better at surveilling internally at the point at which they have just a far greater ability and legitimacy to do that on their own soil than in American universities. So if it's a question of where Chinese students are more free, it's there. And we are fine with having conditions on how the research is done and regulating the research so that this lack of freedom of speech doesn't spill over into how the research is actually conducted. And then with regards to and so just on a comparative, I think we are winning in terms of freedom for Chinese students and them getting exposed to liberal ideas that they can use to dissent against their government. And then with regards to the principle, I will just say that I think that America is a former colonial power that still engages in neo-colonial practices. They're just wrong when they say that it has an obligation to the US. We think it has an obligation to the entire world and to be developing technologies that benefit the entire world. That's going to be important to our second point. So let's talk about US-China relations, because I think this is really important. I want to highlight that there is like I said in the introduction to my speech, things between the US and China are currently quite tense, and there is often like this idea that the US and China should be in competition with each other, and especially in the context of a trade war, cooperation for research is probably the one singular way that the US and China are cooperating at all, and I think that's extremely valuable because that gives each country a stake in the other and gives them a reason not to have military rivalries with the other. When the US does this, this will be seen as a severing of the last tie that the US and China have, and will increase tensions between the two, as the two countries believe that neither one has anything to gain from the other's success, and they only want to undermine the other. What does this look like? This looks like, firstly, well, actually, sorry, before I get into the impacts, I think talking about the reverse, especially right now, there are thankfully talks to end the trade war, and that can be used as a springboard into better relations between the US and China going forward, especially given that if Trump doesn't lose in the 2020 election, it's likely we'll have a Democrat in 2024 and someone who is less anti-China. This can be used as a springboard for more cooperation if they have the tie of research, but that's ruined when you cut this off. What are the impacts of this? So firstly, I think this is more military rivalry. This is more of the US building up its military in the South China Sea in an attempt to undermine China, for example. This leads to the probability of flashpoints. This leads to the probability of a misunderstanding, of a radar malfunction that makes it look like one country has fired upon the other, that starts a conflict. This looks like more funding for things like proxy wars that could seriously hurt people. We think it is really important that you not damage the relations between US and China this way by having the US send a signal that that these things are bad. And then the second thing this means is that it is less likely that the trade war will come to an end soon at the point at which you produce an additional grievance that China doesn't like. This makes negotiations more difficult and more tense, meaning economic harms for both countries as trade is lessened, meaning that you get unemployment and higher prices for consumers in both countries. Does closing have anything?
So let's be honest here. Israeli and Palestinian academics host each other in their families' houses. Indian and Pakistani academics have been friends for decades. No one gives a shit about what academics say about geopolitics.
My case wasn't about like academics speaking out against war. My case was that when you cut this off, you give China and the US no stake anymore in cooperating with each other and send a huge signal that they should be in rivalry. I don't know what that POI was about. That was weird. Okay, second point. Why research is so important. So recognize that we are in a context where Trump has cut university funding for research, and American universities often need funding from wherever they can get to do good projects. So I asked in a POI why China doesn't just like do the research internally, and the reason is that they recognize that there is benefits in having joint research projects, because this creates better research and better technology that both sides can use. Things like greener energy, things like pharmaceuticals. Recognize that 90% of new molecular compounds, that is to say new drugs that like save people's lives, are developed with university funding. And when it is done jointly instead of separately, you get, first of all, more economies of scale. You're able to do larger projects with more funding in general that are able to, like, explore more. And second, you get less duplication of funding when the US and China don't have to be doing these things separately and doing these things in competition with each other. We think this is especially harmful because once you make China once you do this, what's likely to happen is that China is likely to figure out ways to do it on their own, probably like just cooperating, like doing it internally or cooperating with Russia, meaning that they become self-reliant, and that becomes hard to ever go back on at the point at which once China is self-reliant, they don't need the US anymore. That's bad because it means that there is just less research in general that benefits everyone. Everyone benefits when this technology is developed in the public sector in the US, where it's not patented and anyone can use it, compared to if it is developed just by China, where probably the West doesn't have access to it. And so we think that it is better to have more of this university research in general, and in a context where university funding is missing, as I said, this funding is especially important toward that goal. This is bad for US-China relations. This is bad for research in general. We oppose.
I think the leader of opposition, happy to call the deputy prime minister.
Cool. Can you hear me? Cool. To be clear, universities are not just places in which we universities are not just places that are there exclusively to form new drugs and form new things fit oppressive states. Ultimately, universities are also places of critique. This is not necessarily a debate about how the politicians of the United States interact with the politicians of China. Note, whilst sure, this might be something that annoys China a little bit for maybe a second and appears on their radar and is maybe something they can use in a speech one time to point out that the US maybe doesn't like them. I think this is a lot lower down on what would be on Chinese politicians' minds when thinking of problems they have with the United States. I don't think it is the tipping point of how they interact with each other. I think what is massively important is understanding how this actually affects the system of critique within US universities and how this prohibits forms of thought, which is what ultimately a university ought to be doing. Let's be clear. I think if you ask most researchers or most people who work in a university or students of that university if they would like to be tied to an oppressive regime, if they would like to be tied to forms of thought that don't respect people, that don't respect people's ideas, they would say no. The reality is, however, those who work in the funding departments of these universities often, very, very often, would be hypocritical and go against the ideas of it. We think ultimately we stand over barring their ability to be hypocrites to preserve universities' abilities to be spaces of critique. This might sound like an highfalutin way of saying something, but ultimately when the apparatus of critique of states is now beholden to those states, it becomes a lot harder to be a place of learning and critique. What does that mean? Often universities are places where critique is formed. It's not necessarily that you just go to university just to be the person who develops that new drug or whatever, right? There are large other aspects to university. Often it is where new ideas are understood. It is where protests often start. It is where lectures and societies discuss things about the world. Ultimately, I think universities are very often places where liberal thought, and by that I don't mean left-wing thought, I mean free thought, is respected, and the ability to form your own opinion, question things and question the state is there. We also would not stand over universities being 100% state funded either. Not like, and by that I don't mean like not allowing access to university for people, but I mean having state control, or like any state control over what is happening there. I understand that the alternative is that like rich people donate money or that researchers donate money, but we prefer that. The reason we prefer that is we think ultimately one's ability to be in a space where you have freedom of thought, be it over a drug because you're in the drug department, or be it because you're in the liberal arts department, being able to critique is massively important. Why? Because that often is what spurs populations to make major changes. So this might be an intuition pump, but if you go back into some of the most oppressive states in history and you saw people leaving, if you saw that Einstein now had to accept money from anti-Semitic states or anti-Semitic governments, you think that likely he would be that is something that we would stand up against, and that is something we would fight. Why? Because at the point where you allow the oppressor to be part of that funding, you legitimize their space in that conversation. Why is that so problematic? At the point where China is able to say, we have control over aspects of thought in Harvard, it becomes, or in Yale or in wherever, it becomes a lot harder for students of that university or lecturers of that university to speak out. Yes, they might not be fundamentally barred of doing so, but when opening opposition says this is a really good job because we can limit the sorts of research that specific Chinese people do and it's okay, I think ultimately when there's always that fear that the Chinese people in your university are going to be feeding things back to their state, feeding things back to their intelligence. It's things like stopping Hong Kong researchers feeling safe. It's things like stopping anyone who wants to work on surveillance technology from being capable of doing so. Just closing of a POI now.
Look, at the end of the day, the extent to which this critique happens inside these universities is not that large on either side of the house, but the technology that we get and the benefits that we get to the entire world are just much greater.
I'm unsure that the technology becomes an entire benefit, because usually the reason that technology is a benefit is that you have access to it and your enemies don't have access to it, right? So sure, you can argue on this idea of drugs, fine. But like, I think ultimately the whether or not there is an amount, like the tipping point as to whether drug research is going to happen is not Chinese funding, right? There are many other states around the world who are capable of funding drug research. There's many companies around the world who don't have incentives to harm mass populations that are willing to fund drug research, right? However, what China does have an incentive to fund is things like technologies that surveil, or things like technologies that, well, yeah, it's the same thing, right? Surveillance, right? The ability to control, the ability to prohibit developments, right? Sure, I'll take you as well.
Okay, so Chinese students are not any more free in their own country than they are in America, and Harvard accepting research funding from China doesn't prevent other parts of Harvard from criticizing China. Where is your
like
filter?
It does, though. No, like it does, right? At the point where your new building is built by China and has like genuinely, like my university, it was half of my campus was built by China. There's literal Chinese flags in our arts block, right? Like, yes, you can say we'll limit how this is done, but like at the point where someone is giving you $1 billion, it becomes a lot harder to critique how they're giving you that $1 billion, right? The state doesn't then get to say, oh, you can take Chinese money, but you can only take Chinese money if it has zero benefit to China. Then China is unlikely to give that money, right? So that means that it becomes more and more of a Chinese space. Why is that so problematic? Yes, I understand that Chinese students are slightly freer at the point where they're in US universities than they're in Chinese universities. I don't think that's ultimately the comparative in this debate, though, because there are hundreds of thousands of other students in that university that become far, far less free, right? And if Chinese students are not free on both sides, unfortunately, they become not much of a change in this debate. But also I would argue that being a spy or being someone who's beholden to your state ultimately isn't freedom, right? Like being told that you were there, being told that you are there to feed information back to your state is not a form of freedom. It is another form of control, but worse over, it is a form of control that legitimizes, right? Because the weird case that we get from opening opposition is this is a nice form of cooperation. Oh Lord, sorry. Bye, thanks.
I think the Deputy Prime Minister, happy to call the Deputy Leader of Opposition.
Can everyone hear me? I just want to make sure that's the right volume. Okay, so I'm going to address their case, and then I'm going to go on to our case next. So what do they tell you? They tell you a few things. They tell you that Chinese funding is often tied to Chinese students being there or Chinese researchers being there. That might be true, but it doesn't really matter because there's still US researchers being there. It's not like these are completely Chinese entities within US universities. And plus, we can control, like as the US government, how this funding is used, and it has to be monitored and it has to be reported. Like in Harvard, a professor is like going to jail because he didn't report Chinese funding. Like it's a pretty big deal, and we scrutinize it a lot. And so the idea that it's just like unaccountable, whatever's happening under our nose, we have no idea, is not true. Like US intelligence monitors these things. It's like, so they tell you a few things. They say that China is like having these students like come here to like steal information and they're not free. But this is kind of a mischaracterization. They're acting under the assumption that every Chinese student who comes to an American university is now an agent of the Chinese state, actively feeding them back propaganda. I don't know if there are international students in your schools, but do you believe that all of your Chinese friends are secret agents of the Chinese government giving them information? No, most Chinese kids use VPNs and have social media apps not to avoid detection from the Chinese government. It's not like everyone's like a robot following the machine. But even if you don't believe that, the comparative is still much better because as they don't address this monitoring is only about Chinese students. The Chinese government does not care if US students are anti-China. Half the kids in these Ivy League students are anti-China. Like half the kids are conservative. And like none of these people like the Chinese government. There is no argument that there's a lack of anti-Chinese criticism in US universities. This is simply not the case. Every conservative think tank funds US universities, which promotes the most anti-Chinese stuff you can find anywhere. So this doesn't make any sense. Their point is about Chinese students, but they don't address the comparative in that Chinese students are always going to be censored no matter where they are. In fact, they're much freer in the US, as Gwen points out, and they don't respond to because China is much more able to censor internally than in the US. However, once they leave and you lock them out of the US forever, these Chinese students are forever like completely surveilled and they have no opportunity or choice to leave Chinese like oversight. At least in the US, they can choose not to work at a Chinese lab. Like we're only talking about like Chinese labs where the funding goes. It's not that China like puts funds into universities and now has control over the entire thing. That's another mischaracterization. They say that the research limits like what they can do and say. This also doesn't make much sense either. Having research from China, funding from China for research only means you can do more research, not like less research. And they say like constrains what they can say, but they can probably say the same amount wherever they are in the world. Doesn't make, not very comparative. But then they say that it's linked, like their second point is like the same thing, but more like in different frame, like for practical reasons. But it's still, it doesn't make much sense because as the US, we can control whether or not how this research is used. It can't be used for like things that like the Chinese government uses like for malicious intent because the US monitors and registers every bit of Chinese funding which comes into the United States under law and controls what they're allowed to use. Like we don't let them use like explicit technology which is like to suppress Hong Kong or to attack other countries because we can control what they do. Does closing have anything?
Most of the funding of the Chinese Confucius Institutes doesn't go to science, it goes to political and sociological scholarship, which is very hard to discredit because it's subjective. This subjectivity allows China to legitimize its terrible practices. What do you think about that?
We would say that the funding that might go to cultural centers, first of all, these cultural centers, when like the US still has control over what happens in these places, it's not like they're completely Chinese entities. Regardless, we would say that the point of this funding, most of this funding, like the most important part is funding U.S. research. Like lots of U.S. researchers, they look for Chinese funding because the U.S. is just starved of academic funding in general. Like scientific funding is where the impacts come and is where the actual impacts and like depth of this debate is. And I'm going to explain that in a bit. So they say that U.S. universities act as places of critique and free speech and blah, blah, blah. But again, They don't address the comparative, but also this isn't the funding. This isn't necessarily the funding we're talking about. We can block funding which goes to explicit Chinese propaganda cultural institutions. Like if what like as the U.S. if what they're talking about, like if they fund a cultural center and it's obviously like Chinese propaganda, we can block it, and we probably will because our government is using China as like a fear monger against its like voting base to get leverage. Like there's no reason in the U.S. there's no political will to do this. Even Joe Biden is attacking Donald Trump with ads saying he's soft on China. The idea that China is not going to be respected in or like not going to be constrained in this makes no sense, and politically, logistically, logically. And so they say that the free speech is going to be restrained, but again, their free speech is always constrained no matter what school they go to. Other students in the US universities don't care. I don't care. Our school might have Chinese funding. My friends don't seem to care. Their schools have Chinese funding. No one cares. Professors certainly don't care either, because they're normally the ones who write all the papers that are the basis for the anti-Chinese policy and stuff in the US. What do we tell you, and why is it more important? We tell you that the alternative is much worse because China can do this internally, and that they become self-reliant, and all the harms they talk about are forever done. But why do we outweigh, even if like their arguments are true? Because technology is more important than this criticism, than this critique, because this critique is relatively minor. The difference between critique on our side of the house and their side of the house in the US doesn't change. Like if more Chinese students come here and none of them say anything, it doesn't change. Like there's no impact here. Meanwhile, the amount of technology being produced does change. It changes like the world, because like pharmaceutical innovation saves lives all over the world. Like energy could like stop climate change, all these issues. But then the second reason we outweigh is because the US has a principal obligation as a colonial nation to develop technology which helps the entire world and increases the well-being for everyone. That obligation outweighs the obligation to stop Chinese, like to not support a single Chinese student from like talking about the Chinese government in a good way, like that. Our obligation is simply more important to the world as a colonial state than it is to the Chinese government for the abstract terms. And they don't address the fact that we don't have to prove that it's a tipping point for like US-China relations, but we prove that these flashpoints and the tensions it creates drastically harms US-China relations and drastically undermines our ability to act cooperatively and to make the world a safer place, and to not have just blatant tensions rising and like wars and flashpoints and no cooperation on any issue. To secure research for the world, for cooperation, please oppose.
I thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition. Happy to call the Member of Government.
Hey, can you hear me? Yeah, thanks. Okay. Opening opposition say that they don't have to accept the bad parts of the research funding which comes from China. So they make it conditional, they won't allow surveillance or it to be used in bad ways. I think this is fair. I think this mitigates the worst successes of OG. That's why in our extension, we're going to take them at their best and say even in cases where they like make this research conditional, they only accept some types of research, while you're structurally unable to have effective regulation on the kind of research which is produced and funded through China, and why you can't ensure that it is independent to the extent they want to talk about. That's why we're going to run an extension, which I think clashes nicely with kind of what opening opposition set up in this debate. Before I go on to that, I just want to wash a few things, because I think so much is being said in this debate, which is kind of symmetric and just not that important to actually what changes. First of all, this idea of technology and development through research and how everything gets better. A couple of responses. Like, first of all, just to point out that the US is miles ahead in terms of technological development, in terms of Silicon Valley, in terms of research. I don't think the massive contributions come from China, such as the big delta. I think most endowments to UK universities come from the US government. Like $11 billion goes to is the endowment to Harvard from the US government. I don't think the delta from China is that significant. But secondly, even if we were to assume it's significant, I just want to give the intuition pop of what sort of research China funds, because China has no interest in funding research which is going to benefit everyone, because it's a classic collective action problem. Why would China want to invest in research taking place in the US, which is then going to have spin-off benefits and technologies like in the US, as opposed to developing that and concentrating those benefits within China? They're literally in a trade war right now. There's no reason why they go through helping them and developing their technology and their benefits when China can keep those benefits from themselves, because they're investing in something which they get diffuse benefit from, because the whole world benefits from it, as opposed to them keeping it for themselves. else. That's why I think the comparative is that China only gives research funding when it has a direct incentive to do so, which necessarily means it must disproportionately benefit China, such that it should happen that way. That's why we think the kind of research is more likely to be things which legitimize the Chinese state rather than things which are irrelevant to politics, which I just don't think is that significant part of this debate. Second thing I want to wash is this clash about like Chinese students and liberalizing Chinese students, because realistically, we have to think about who the Chinese students are going to UK universities, US universities, and realistically, this is the elite in China. There are so many reasons for this. Even like having to speak English to go to a UK university is a massive sign of like class differential in China, which means you're more likely to have connection to the powerful, connection to the elite, particularly given like academic elitism is like a sign of prestige among the powerful in China. It's often like a lot of you don't go because you want to like liberalize and expand your horizons if you've lived in a state for like 2 decades which told you that like China's like told you a certain worldview. There's no reason you'd go to question that. The reason you go is often to like get an Ivy League degree, come back, and then join the ruling elite in China, right? I don't think that significantly changes, particularly given that there are so many reasons to do with like culture clash, to do with being comfortable in like having political debates and expanding ideas, which mean that you're not not likely to do so just because of the technicalities of who funded your research. So I think even if there's some change in this debate, I just don't think it's as significant as teams wanted to make out in terms of transforming the way that Chinese students feel and how comfortable they feel in spaces, given the way they've been trained to think about the state as all-encompassing and going over so many aspects. I think that's important to point out. Let's move on to our extension, because we think existing regulations don't work in making sure that funding or research is effective and independent. Broadly, regulations on academic research aim to do 2 things. First of all, there are rules which are intended to not let research be weaponized to legitimize or propagandize a single government. This is an aim of the rules. And secondly, the rules aim to achieve independence and academic integrity. The reasons that for a lot of the most important research about China itself, you can't do this in this kind of research are for a few reasons. First of all, to do with academic subjectivity. This is what Hamza mentioned in the POI. And I think this is massively important because the thing is, it's incredibly easy to get out of like exposing certain things or having certain discussions in research, because we all know the kind of conceptual frameworks and tools that we use in political theory, in sociology, and these ideas are so subjective because they depend on your frame of references. Concepts that we use to evaluate different political phenomena like power, rights, sovereignty, oppression are all relative and all based on your understanding. I think this means that because conceptual frameworks and ideas are always valued, and it's easy to spin them in subjective ways, particularly given even if it's data-based and evidence-based, you can spin data in different ways. You can present selected parts of the data and you can clean that. And when you're doing it at the research end, it's incredibly hard to identify for most people consuming that research at the other end how the process has gone through, because methodologies are specifically designed or can be designed to give results that you want to give. I think that's why it's incredibly difficult, particularly given subjectivity happens, first of all, because the credibility of academics often gives them immunity. Like if you're a Harvard professor and you say something, or you're a Harvard professor and you're affiliated with some research, if you then like say something, people just believe that because of your credibility. So it's much easier to convince people of things which like have been subjectively explained and people accept it as facts. But I also think it works on the flip side, as in the idea of subjectivity isn't so strong that it can be and so I think that's incredibly important in terms of how you can spin things to like give results, and it's difficult to check it because structurally there are no ways which you can check these kind of things which are violated. But secondly, and most importantly, basically significant amounts of the data about China comes from the Chinese government, right? So even the data which, even if you were to go through an independent research process, you're basing it on data sets which are biased in the collection in the first place. The reason for this is that China doesn't let in foreign researchers and independent researchers to be able to conduct research in China because they don't want to do that, because they don't want to have that kind of exposure. That means that the institutions which gather data within China are often self-justifying and design methodologies in ways which bolsters their own like legitimacy. This problem doesn't exist in other contexts because if you're a democracy and you're open, people can research anywhere. But secondly, China is unique in its capacity to quash this kind of independent research which happens in its borders, which doesn't happen in other places, which makes it a very unique case. So I think the data we get is reliable, which these research is based on. The flip side is that China is likely to open itself up into independent research, which it doesn't currently, if that's the condition in which it gains exposure in US universities. Why is this? Because I think exposure is better than having the perfect clean narrative.
Last chance.
Right now, we just give them both. Yeah, sure.
Okay, so as I said in my case, China benefits from things like green energy production and drug research and knows that it can do that better with US help. In a context where Trump is cutting US university funding massively, how do we not get lots more research?
I think China has incentive to concentrate benefits within their own borders. Hamza will talk more about that and about your case. I think China want exposure in US universities because it's an ideological power tool and a prestige project, particularly for all the Chinese students going to US universities who they want to show are so important. The impact of our case is that even if we get less research, which I can see we do, we might do, we're much more independent and valuable research because it's more reliable. Why is more reliable and less research preferable? First of all, because when you have reliable findings, you have a more solid basis for further research because you can make assumptions and then draw implications from that rather than just being unsure. This means that it reduces the need for duplication because if data sets aren't reliable or data isn't reliable, then you have to keep doing it to be able to solve and make sure you have reliable assumptions on which to operate. Secondly, I think just instrumentally having one reliable paper questioning key assumptions, which is based on independent research, has the ability to transform the way people think and challenge assumptions in the way that a massive body of unreliable data does it. Even if you do care about liberalizing students like opening government, we're more likely to persuade them with independent, reliable research rather than ones which are always with political sentence and always tied up in subjectivity. I'm very proud to propose.
I thank the member of government. Happy to call the member of opposition.
Three, two, one. Governments in this debate are very much concerned with having the most high quality research we can possibly have. We have no idea why this is important. We think nobody reads academic publications. We think that there's a bunch of Chinese propaganda going on in social media, in major stream media. We think that China is still funding academics in Europe and in Australia, meaning we still can't do anything even if the United States dislikes them. But we think that getting new technologies is actually important and is actually changing the lives of various people. We think that this goes much deeper than what First House has already told you. So we're going to talk about several things. We're going to talk about technology, what types of technologies China has the incentive to invest in and why this is important. We're going to talk about whether we care about having less critical academic publications, and then we're going to talk about regulation and why it is possible. Let's talk about technology. The rebuttal will be integrated. Right, so we think that the thing is that China today is trying to make a move from being a manufacturing economy and in many places still an agricultural economy to an economy that is much more based on technology, right? And we also think that China has the incentive to be a much more powerful player in the places where we have developing countries, because we think that they know that they can benefit from, for example, Africa, which has huge economic potential and a lot of investment from other areas in Southeast Asia. And we think that means they want to show that they have something to give to those countries and to aid them, right? We think that this is what helps it become a global power and make sure it stays relevant in the modern economy. We think this means that China invests massively, specifically when they tell you, oh, China doesn't care about technologies that help other people. This is just not true. China is investing massively in green energy because it understands this is what's going to fuel the continuation of its development. It's what makes it part of the liberal powers that care about climate change. This is what gives it legitimacy as a global player. We think that this means that China, which is also a very big greenhouse gas emitter, is going to make a huge change. It means that it invests massively in network infrastructure, things like 5G and fiber optics, because this is a lot of the way that it's trying to move its economy from a manufacturing economy to a tech-based economy. We think these are things that are getting internet to people that didn't have internet connection before in Africa, which is, or in Russia or whatever, which is a lot of the projects they're having, is extremely meaningful for those people because the internet opens up the ability to be educated, opens up the ability to be connected to the rest of the world, to build social connections and all of that. And we think that improving the internet where it does exist is still a huge impact. We think it invests a lot in agricultural technologies. Again, first because it needs to still feed its own population, which is huge, but also because this is something that it has to offer to Africa and Southeast Asia. And this literally means being able to feed and give food safety to people that didn't have it before. It investing in computer. All these technologies are super within its incentives, and this is the type of things that it is developing. What do we get from this? Well, the US is very better in tech anyway, so China makes no delta. It's true that the United States is better in developing tech, and that is why China invests in it, but that does not mean that China does not have massive amounts of money to invest and sees this as its main national interest, because as we said, the economic incentives that it has rely on this, and therefore they just give a bunch of money, and we do need this money, right? And then they say us, why would China want to invest in the US? Because then the US just takes the research. This is not how research works. Publications are public. That is why they're called publications, like when they're on public websites, everybody can read them, China can use them, this is available to everyone. Of course, China still has the incentive, plus if they're funding the university, probably they have access to the publication. So yeah, they get that, but also they get the benefit of having a very smart country working on the tech they need, which is great for them. Let's talk about But then we do agree that probably in the social sciences, this is going to affect somewhat the criticalism of the publications. So first of all, CG already give you one reason for why this is not important in any way, right? Because all the research going into China is based on data from China, because we cannot gather data independently about China. What does this mean? That even if we want to do independent research, we just can't do it because we don't have the data. So it's going to be screwed anyway. So we don't know how we can get any meaningful research that's going to make a change, even if they did show you that research makes any change. We think nobody reads academic publications. Like, honestly, most academic publications are even cited within their own communities. Nobody cares, okay? We think that China just cannot fund all the universities. We think that the United States has a bunch. Probably you're still going to have 3 universities. Also, since there is so much tension between the United States and China, that means that donors from the United States in some universities are going to demand there is no funding from China. So we think that you still get this competition between the China-funded universities and not China-funded universities. 3, we think that the thing is that just there's so much other Chinese propaganda going on that there cannot be any data for this. Like, China is funding propaganda on social media platforms. China is funding propaganda as in just paying celebrities and things like that to say positive things about it. China is trying to sell its culture abroad. We think that this is things that have much more impact in terms of how China is viewed and the political support for actions against China and for holding China accountable. We think that actually the United States media loves to play up how China is a terrible actor, because this creates a buzz, so we don't need academic publications for this. We just think that if China can create propaganda, it will do it outside the academia, and if it cannot, this will happen regardless of the academia is not important. But lastly, notice that even if we have this debate, that doesn't mean China stops investing in Europe and Australia, and we don't think the United States can do anything to China without having their cooperation. They cannot stop 5G, they cannot stop China's rise as we see today, because they cannot get the EU to cooperate with them. This doesn't change tomorrow, so again, 0 impact to the case of governments, but a lot of impact to the case of, having better agriculture in Africa. Before we continue, opening house. Closing government.
The reason that China puts most of its climate change funding into the UN and not Harvard is that when it's published, the US doesn't get to say it was Harvard. China gets to say it was China at the UN.
I don't care who says who it belongs to. I care if there is less climate emissions. I care if there is more food for Africa. I care if more people are connected to the internet. Like, credits are not important outside of the academic world, and we need to go outside of the academic world and see that the world exists outside of our universities. Okay, we think that in addition to all this, we do want to point out that regulations do exist and can exist, right? We think that if the United States is doing things that are literally illegal, there are legal responsibilities for this, right? If you tell people your employees that they cannot speak out on social media, or your students that they cannot protest against the things going on in Hong Kong, then that means that you're liable to be sued, right? This is the same if your research infringes patent laws and things like that. You're liable to be sued, and universities are liable to do that. We think that there's a lot of PR problems because China is such a huge issue in the United States. And there's the trade wars and the media playing it up and all of that. That means that if universities seem too nice to China, if universities stop anti-Hong Kong protests, there's a lot of protests against them, meaning they get less US donations, they get less students, they get less academic publications because people are wary of them and are afraid that they might be not good publications. And we think that there's many reasons for the universities not to act badly in these places. We think for all these reasons, tech is the most important, and we achieve it much better. Please oppose.
I thank the member of opposition and happy to call the government whip.
Can you hear me? Listening to closing opposition, I do have hope for human nature. In closing opposition's world, China does not want to put its name on anything for political benefit or geopolitics, just like every human being and fucking country has for the past 100 years of civilized politics. They want to do it for the people. They want to do it for the kids. They want to do it for climate change, for God's sake. That's just not true. I just think that this belies how political nature, human nature works. People want to put their name on research. If the world was the sort of world CEO is talking about, we wouldn't fucking have climate change. We have climate change because countries have collective action problems where they want to do certain things which benefit each other, etc., etc. First, I'm going to take out CEO, and I'll be very honest here. I just think most of CEO was just OO, and then they added like 2 additional max, and I'm going to give 8 responses to why technological research doesn't work. Response number 1: most research about science happens in places like the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, at the UNFCCC. It happens in science labs. This is really important for me to point out. There's a problem solution gap with closing up and opening up insofar as most of the scientific research that they want doesn't happen on university campuses. Number 2, most of the research endowment for the places that they're talking about, like Harvard and Berkeley, comes from the US government. I just think this is important to point out, like a quarter of Harvard's endowment comes from the US government. What marginal benefit of science they're seeking here is extremely unclear to me. Number 3, the West is miles ahead in most of this scientific research. There's a reason that Silicon Valley exists. There's a reason that CERN exists. All of these things mean that even if we have to give up every single bit of scientific research on our side of the debate, you're still having lots of beneficial scientific research. What they had to prove to us was that the quantum of Chinese funding specifically to universities is so high that they outweigh the benefits of the research on our side. I don't think that they do that comparative. Hopefully they will. Response number 4, what sort of research does China fund? I think it's important to point out that China, specifically in universities, not in the UN, not in scientific labs, specifically in universities, China funds research which benefits China. What does this look like? It looks like the 800 Confucius Institute set up by China in every university from Oxford to Harvard to Stanford. It looks like funding academics to talk about legitimizing China's domestic politics and foreign politics, because that's where China's incentives lie, something which Kira talked about. Number 5, it's also important to point out that at the same time, they have to weigh this up against China's incentives on our side, because Kira told you that even if we have less research, China has incentives to retain research from these Western campuses. And yes, this research will be more critical. Yes, this research will be more independent, but China wants people to talk about the rise of China, just like I have to every fucking day at LSE or at Oxford or at Harvard. They want these things to be talked about, even if it's more critical. Kira gave you 4 mechanisms for why China has incentives to retain ownership of this research, even if it's slightly more critical. I think that was very important to point out. But finally, I'm just going to say the benefits of this research do have to be weighed up against our benefits, and our benefits are exclusive. What does that mean? Research about science can occur from funding from other countries, funding from private donors, not even at universities. So their benefits aren't exclusive to their argument. Our benefits are exclusive to our argument because Chinese funding of US universities is the only propaganda outfit that China has abroad, which means that we get exclusively harms from this funding, while a lot of their benefits can be accrued from elsewhere. I think that's really, really important to point out. What did they say in response to our argument? Firstly, best rebuttal ever. Nobody cares about academic scholarship. The intellectual justification for Nazism came from Nietzsche. The end of history talked about the end of the Cold War. The clash of civilizations informed the Iraq War. What the fuck are you on about? Like, academic scholarship matters, especially political and sociological scholarship, the sort of scholarship that we're talking about. Response number 2, propaganda outfits exist anywhere. No, propaganda outfits exist on the inside. Weibo is censored. China's Global Times publishes an article someone reads in Beijing, but we don't buy it abroad. We don't buy that shit when it goes across Chinese borders. Again, Kira's extension, the only thing that China has abroad as a propaganda outfit are these Confucius Institutes, are the funding which is happening in US universities and other universities, etc., etc. That's what you have to weigh up. Final thing that they said to our extension, they will now go to UK, Europe, and Australia. Okay, I think it's just like fair to be like, we'd want to ban it there as well. I think the motion gives us that fiat. But 2, I just think that if the US does something, it's an opinion leader in the West, so other countries will shift similarly. I just don't think that was a sufficient response to our extension. Most of our extension still stand at the end of closing opposition's speech. Now what I want to do is I want to quickly go over OO's 2 additional claims. The first claim that they had was that, look, the academic cooperation is really important. I just want to stress test this panel, because I think that academic cooperation and the benefits of scientific research have always been important. You literally had Jewish researchers being saved by German researchers during World War II, but that didn't stop World War II. Everyone wants science, everyone wants research, but the problem is that geopolitics always wins. But that's just a washing their argument. I think it's actually worse on their side, because this academic scholarship serves as a legitimizing tool, where at the point of which China can say, Harvard said that we're better than the US. Harvard is saying that the trade war that we're winning is the one that we're winning against Trump. So if anything, this furthers and fuels the conflict, because China now has a legitimizing tool against the United States in this propaganda outfit. Really important, I think, to point out. Also, this argument is equally wonderful. The argument about China's incentives, 1 second, to still fund research, even if it's more independent and critical minded. I'll finally weigh us up against OG before that, quickly.
Yeah, I don't think you were listening. Our point wasn't about academics speaking out against the conflict. It was about the fact that when you symbolically cut off cooperation and remove the last stake that the US and China have in each other, you make tensions significantly increase, making things like flashpoints more likely and the trade war harder to end.
I agree with you. That's exactly what I said. I'm not talking about protests and picket fences. I'm literally talking about the benefits of scientific research, the symbology of culture, all of that stuff. I'm just saying it doesn't count for jack shit when you have guns and butter on the line. Those are things which are much more important for people than anything else. We're up against OG. OG cannot win this debate because Chinese students tend to come from the Communist Central Party, and they are funded on those fucking scholarships when they go to these universities. They tend to be part of the ruling elite. These people are not coming here to expand their intellectual horizons. They're coming here so that they can go back and say, I studied at Harvard. Finally, and this is very important to point out, even if the argument about Chinese students is true on OO and OG, it is contingent on our argument, because Chinese students can only be convinced by impartial Chinese scholarship. If impartial Chinese scholarship isn't occurring on Western campuses, then these Chinese students will never be sung. Very important to point out. Panel, we've shown to you that Chinese students were not an important stakeholder in this debate. We've also shown to you that academic cooperation is often overshadowed by broader geopolitics. The main part of this debate was independent and critical-minded academic scholarship. We've shown to you the benefits of that. Very, very proud to propose.
I think the government whip, and happy to call the opposition whip. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Here's what's not analysis. The words, well, Nazi propaganda started in academia is not analysis as to why anyone cares this has any significant effect. It is not mitigated by all the other things that China can and is doing, and all the other ways in which we can mitigate like opinions and thoughts. Just really government's cases do not stand in this debate. Let's talk about this in 2 clashes. 1, we're going to talk about free thought. Doesn't matter how it matters, to what extent we get it. 2, we're going to talk about technology. Let's go. Let's talk about free thought. So here's what we get. We get this notion that, look, opening government tell us they're going to be Hong Kong, like students coming from China, Hong Kong, and things like that are going to feel uncomfortable speaking out. The second, you also put money into these places and into these universities, then the faculties also don't speak out. There's a limit to the extent to which the research gets to certain issues that talk about the problems that China is having. You have biases, all of these things, right? Netta tells you like a ton of stuff that gets very, very little response on this. First, who cares? Literally, neither team has any actual explanation as to who is actually reading these research, who is affected by it. The explanation is, well, people think that they're smart, and so they listen to what they say. But the point is that I don't know anyone who has ever read an academic paper or heard what an Oxford professor has, or like Harvard professor has to say about something to do with China. We think this is very, very minimal, and we think the extent to which this has any impact is really, really small. 2, what we tell you is that there's tons of funding inside the United States, also for anti-China stuff, right? That there are bodies that do that, that there's an interest to do that, right? And so in that sense, if people are smart, then cool. So Harvard is funded by China, but there's a department at Yale that isn't. So I don't know. I don't care. The extent to which this massively changes anything, really, really minimal. 3, in terms of the extent to which we're playing this power game, what things people actually care about are things that China is funding anyway. That's mass media, in which they put money into TV, they put money into creating propaganda, things along those lines. We're not taking that away. We literally cannot stop it, and that is not something the US is trying to do. That is not in this debate. But lastly, we tell you that even if we were there, the fact of the matter is that right now what people are interested interested in, and the news that's happening is that politicians are actively speaking out against these things. It's getting into the papers. People are talking about the things that are happening in Hong Kong. Like Donald Trump is telling people how terrible China is, etc., etc. I don't understand how that is outweighed by the fact that, oh yay, nice Confucius building, whatever. Like, let's think about the way that people are actually impacted and the way in which they actually engage with these issues. We don't understand to what extent this matters. Really, just very little response. But also, let's go further than this, because causing government actually just undermine their own case with the following two sentences. One, anyway, we have no access to actual data that's going to do anything. But two, China is really interested in us doing it. So if we actually force them to, then they'll give us access to this data if that's what we make it contingent on. So it sounds like we can make it, the funding contingent on them giving us access to full data and free speech, and then they'll let us do it anyway. Sounds great to me. Sounds like they've undermined their own case by explaining that this is in China's massive interest. Sounds like they don't have a case. Let's see what answers we got to this from causing government, right? Because they said, well, look, people think that this is smart and like Nazism was based on this. Like I said, non-analysis, that is not an actual answer to all of that stuff. Two, we just think that it's, even if some ideas have come out of academia and has come out of some people saying smart things, that doesn't mean that they cannot come out of all the other places that China can do this. It doesn't mean that we don't have the other way to mitigate it in all that we do. The extent to which this has any impact on any way on the real world, not proven, grit. We're in a pretty good position to win this debate. Who am I going to take? I'm going to take closing. Talk to me.
One, you don't read the paper literally, you read them about them in the news, just like all normal human beings do. And two, the papers are read by the ruling elite, the people who make a difference in our lives.
Cool. Great. So one, I haven't seen a lot of newspaper articles talking about the fun Confucius thing that you're talking about either. Literally no one cares. And two, the ruling elite right now that we're talking about, we can see who the politicians are. And we can see exactly what statements they're making. We can see exactly the extent to which they're currently on China. Clearly, this is not being effective and mitigated by literally all the other things that we've said in terms of the counterbalance and all of the other stuff that we talked about. Okay, so then let's talk about what does matter. And here we're going to talk about technology, because the opening opposition tries to tell you, look, they fund really important tech, and this is very, very helpful. They get attacked on this significantly by governments who tell them, one, why is it actually true that this is the main thing or a significant part of what China is funding? What is their interest in this? They only care about their own interests. And two, why do we actually need Chinese funding for this? And this is exactly the hole that Netta fills in terms of explaining to you the extent to which this is massively important. Because what he says is, what is so critical here is to notice that this is funding of very specific kinds of technology is massively in China's interest insofar as their economy is greatly dependent on it. They're going through a massive shift where they have to expand and they have to move from what was a manufacturing economy to a different economy. That means they need to create these kinds of technologies that the United States as a body has far, far less interest in creating. And that's why even if they give tons of funding to Harvard or Yale or whatever, what they give funding to is different to the kinds of things that China can fund on a massive level and is interested in funding on a massive level. Let's talk about what those things are. We're talking about things like the kind of agricultural technology that needs to happen in China and will then happen in the rest of the developing world that is not the same as the kind of agricultural technology that is necessary in the United States. We're talking about things like green technology that is not popular right now in the United States in any way and is not massively being funded by them because there's a very big anti to that politically, but that China needs and requires in order to keep their people healthy and safe, and because they think that in the long term this is a way for them to get out and to boom their economy. Three, we're talking about massive technological advancements in things like 5G or things along those lines that again China is seeing as their only source or like the most likely source of being able to push themselves forward in the future. And if the United States does not hang their entire hat on it, does not see as the most important thing they need to do because they think that it happens enough in Silicon Valley or things along those lines. So that is why it's critically, and that is why this China massively funds these kinds of things that are massively important in literally saving lives in terms of the technological improvements to productivity, in terms of agriculture and growing food, in terms of all green energy and all the things that Netta talked about. What are the responses that we get to that, right? Why do we say, why do we need it from them, etc. All these things. One, we just think like we said, they give massive amounts of money. They're one of the few countries that can rival, and bodies that can rival a massive amounts of money that can be given to these technologies and actually spent. And they give them to different interests because it is in their interest and it is their incentive, but that a lot of other bodies don't have, and certainly not other bodies that have that amount of money to give. But then they tell us, well, most of this just happens in the UN anyway, so what difference? We tell you, no, one, this is just factually incorrect. Tons of it still has to happen in universities, but why does that have to happen in universities? Because the top researchers that we accept, the United States has some of the best minds that are thinking about these things, and that is why China needs and requires their cooperation and is willing to give them money and work with them on these issues because it's so necessary for them and because they need it. They're the ones that exist in these spaces, and so they need, this is one of the places that it is critical that this research happens so that we get it fast and that we get it in the best way and that we get all the benefits that we talked about. This is much bigger than anything the governments had discussed in terms of any actual impacts. It is also, finally, much bigger than the point that we got from opening opposition on the idea of like flashpoints and this being the last connection between the United States and China. We think that this is just not the last connection. There's tons of trade that goes on no matter what trade war that cannot be disconnected under any circumstance. The extent to which the research at university is what's going to make a difference in terms of people like attacking each other and things like that is really, really small. We think there are plenty of other flashpoints that are relevant right now, like Hong Kong and things like that. The extent to which this is going to make a difference and suddenly cause any of the big net harms they talk about is very, very small. But our impact stand, please oppose. Thank you, everyone. This was really interesting. I'll see you after the break. Good luck. Yeah.